Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to our session this afternoon looking at learner wellbeing and evaluating progress of learner wellbeing. Just before we get started and we do some introductions, just our usual protocols for our session this afternoon is just to make sure you remember to turn off your microphone when you're not speaking, and that just helps prevent any background noise interference. It's also helpful if you keep your video switched off. We are recording this session this afternoon, so if you don't want to be seen on the recordings that will be available until the end of November, then it's best to keep your video switched off. We would ask that you try to be as present as possible during the session, and if you do have any questions or comments for our presenters today, then please feel free to use the chat function to ask anything or make any comments. If you lose connection this afternoon, don't panic, just come back in using the joining instructions that you received earlier. And also, if you have any technical issues, which I know there have been some very small technical issues, then just use the chat function to speak to our easy colleagues, and hopefully they'll be able to help you. However, if it is your chat function that is the issue, then please just raise your hand and somebody can come and support you with that. We would also be delighted if you could tweet about being here this afternoon. I'm sure if you've been to some of the other sessions over the last couple of days, we've all been encouraging everybody to use our hashtag SLF online to share your experience of being in the sessions. And finally, most importantly, we would like you to make sure you enjoy this session this afternoon. So this afternoon, you're here to hear about some practical examples of evaluating progress of learner wellbeing. I'm your facilitator for the session. My name's Lorna Aitken. I'm Senior Education Officer in the Inclusion, Wellbeing and Equalities team at Education Scotland. I'm not going to be doing very much of the talking this afternoon. I'm going to be leaving that to Maureen Nugent, who is a newly appointed attainment advisor here at Education Scotland. But I'll leave her introduction I'll leave her to do her own introductions and tell you a little bit about herself and where she's come from. And also we have Ali Mitchell, who's an educational psychologist in Glasgow City Council, who's going to share an overview of some of the research that he's been doing in and around this area as part of this project. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Maureen, who is going to give you the overview and an introduction to the GMWP. We all love an acronym, so Maureen will explain more about that just shortly. So Maureen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I would like to share with you today the GMWP, which is the Glasgow Motivation and Wellbeing Profile. I'd also like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day and your busy week to join our session today as we explore evaluating progress of learners' wellbeing. Now, as Lorna had mentioned, I am just a recently appointed attainment advisor just last month with Education Scotland. But previous to that, I was a Glasgow head teacher for the last 8 years. I was a head teacher of St Brendan's Primary School in Yoker, and we have developed the GMWP over the last 4 years. So today I will talk about St Brendan's experience with the GMWP. Along with literacy and numeracy, health and wellbeing is a responsibility of all practitioners. It is important that schools have a clear understanding of health and wellbeing needs of their pupils in order that they can plan and provide and facilitate appropriate support. It is vital that schools and supports and interventions are evaluated to ensure continuous improvement and to contribute to the school's ability to get it right for every child. Whilst monitoring literacy and numeracy is generally recognised as being essential in improving standards, it's also important to track health and wellbeing. And this was identified in the Personal and Social Education Review of 2018. and was included as one of the recommendations to take forward. Moving on, please, Lorna. Thank you. So this is our story. This is St Brendan's Primary School in Yoker in the northwest of Glasgow. And this is our story from 2020 to 2021 of how we've used the GMWP. It's a one-page summary, but to take you back 4 years, we started looking at developing the GMWP as part of gathering evidence to one of our PEF interventions. Now, the GMWP originally comes originally from the Motivated School 50 set questionnaire. But 4 years ago, we started to look at the 20 questions, and this has developed over the last few years. So if I could just draw your attention to some of the things on our page, you will notice at the left-hand side there's a lovely little graphic of St Brendan's with a love heart, and that is because at the heart of everything that we do in St Brendan's, support and wellbeing is core to all of our improvements. And by using the GMWP, both in November and May, we have a comparative data to evidence that the health and wellbeing programmes across our whole school have had a positive impact on the wellbeing of our young children. So why do we use the GMWP? To support and improve wellbeing, to involve the young people and the children in decision making, and to provide opportunities for pupil leadership around wellbeing. Also at the right hand side, underneath the Glasgow Psychological Services badge, you'll notice that St Brendan's were part of an educational psychological research case study in the use of the GMWP, and Ali will go into that in more detail throughout the presentation. So the GMWP is a wellbeing self-report tracker for young people. It's a 20-item questionnaire, and this tool can be used to monitor and track learners' wellbeing. By using this tracker, we can provide a platform for young people to share how they're feeling. The wellbeing profile empowers children and young people to take part in meetings about themselves. It also gives a framework with which to express their views and help to identify next steps in their own learning, linking this to getting it right, our GIRFEC process. And it's also worth noting that this is not a standardised tool for assessment. If we could move on, please, Lorna. Thank you. The wellbeing profile, the GMWP, is founded on the self-determination theory. This theory suggests that people can become self-determined or motivated when their needs for agency, affiliation and autonomy are fulfilled. The theory of motivation suggests that people tend to be driven by a need to grow and gain fulfilment. The Wellbeing Profile, Glasgow Motivation and Wellbeing Profile, GMWP, articulates the Scottish Government's emphasis on wellbeing at the heart of getting it right for every child, the GIRFEC approach, with each of the aspects, agency, affiliation and autonomy, linking seamlessly with the wellbeing indicators in a number of ways. The GMW profile produces a score for each of these areas. Agency is a section which reflects the degrees to which young people feel they are achieving and active. Affiliation is a sense of that belonging. It reflects the degree to which a young person feels nurtured and included. And autonomy is a sense of self-determination. I am allowed and I am trusted. And this has two sections linked to feeling respected and responsible. Negotiation, the degree to which a young person is able to have their own needs met whilst also respecting the needs of others. And also expression, this is the degree to which a young person is able and willing to express themselves and also their needs. And the fourth continuum is the extent to which a young person feels healthy and safe within school. As we move on, what is the GMWP? This slide shows 20 questions. They have been carefully selected, linked to the self-determination theory and the wellbeing indicators, and it's preferable not to edit these questions. So as we move on, we're thinking, how will we get started? If this is something that you think that may be useful for your school, your local authority or your class to look at this year, this is where you can find the resources. So there are two places. You can find the Wellbeing Profile within the learning resources of the National Improvement Hub. And in this area, you'll find this provides the theory behind the tool. Alternatively to that, you could go straight to the GMWP Globalog, and here you will find very clear and short instruction videos and all of the resources that you'll need to be able to take this forward within your own school setting. If we could just move on, please, thank you. So how to get started in a very simplified forum. We have two steps. So we open up the Glow forum. It has a set of 20 questions. When we have collated this information, we click a button and it opens the responses in Excel. And at the right-hand side of the slide, this is an example of what the Excel will look like from the Glow forum. And we just click copy. And moving on to step 2. So step 2, we copy the Glow form onto an analysis grid. Now at the right hand side here, this analysis grid is what I call, this is where all the magic happens. And this is the work of David Patrick, who's a Deputy Principal Psychologist in Glasgow. And David has been developing this work with St Brendan's for the past 4 years. At the bottom of the analysis, if I could just point you towards, is a little red box. Now you won't actually see what it says, but it's point B and the box before is point A. Now this is really important because this is how you can work out your comparative data. So you copy and paste from the Glow form into point A. That will allow you to look at the data, it will allow you to access bar charts. You can look at individuals, you can look at groups, you can look at whole school. For today's presentation, I have just collated a whole school information. And then when you repeat this, possibly at the second part of the term, so in St Brendan's, we would carry out one GMWP in November and then repeat it in May. This is then when you would use the point B, the little tabs at the bottom. If I could just move on now, please, Lorna. So over the next few slides, I would like to just share with you an example of a whole school comparative data from 2020 to 2021. So moving on, please. Thank you. So this is our data that we gained from November data from 2020. So as I mentioned previously, the part 1, the step 1, was about using the Glow form. So the Glow forum we used with the whole school, we collected that data in, we transferred it onto the analysis grid, and then this is our point A results. And you'll notice it's very clear you've got the 20 questions. Then you have 3 columns. You have the green column, the blue column and the red. Now the green column indicates a yes, an answer yes, or a score between 8 and 10 stars. Our blue column indicates a sometimes answer, and this would be between 4 and 7 stars. And a red column is no, and it would be between 1 and 3 stars. Now we have used this data during our tracking meetings, our professional dialogue meetings, with every class within the primary school from primary 1 to 7. We have shared this data on the large screen, and then we have really opened up a really rich dialogue with the children and with the staff as to look to see where are our successes here and where are the areas that we really would like to focus on. And this is really basing our next steps on what the children are actually telling us within the school. Now, as we were doing our analysis of the data and we were having a discussion with the children, we were thinking this is actually a little bit busy to be shown to the children. So we decided to use the next slide, which just collates the 20 questions into our 3 categories. And we found this to be more user-friendly. And what we've used with this, then we've been able to print it out into large A3, and all the classes then are able to have this displayed. So as you will notice, we've got quite a lot over in the green, so that's really good. That's, you know, these are our things to celebrate. And we've got some in the amber, and then we've got a few over in the red, which is obviously things that these are things as a whole school we really want to focus on. Now remember, this was in November. This was just part of our returning to school and our recovery. At this point, we were not aware that then we were going to go into another school lockdown, another school closure. So this is what we had in November. We repeated the same process again in May. We carried out the 20 question questionnaire with all the pupils in the school. We then collated it onto the Glow form, copied it over, and if we move on to the next slide, this will show us our May data. Now, this information, as you can see, is quite heavily balanced over onto the red section, whereas our November data was definitely more balanced onto the green section. So this is a real area of priority for us within the school. If we could move on to the next slide. So this is where we gather our comparative data from point A to point B. And you can clearly see from the little red stars at the bottom, the percentage change. This clearly illustrates that our change was not positive between 2020 and 2021. Now, however, taking into consideration all the challenges that we faced this year during the pandemic, this was actually not totally unexpected for our school. But the benefits of having this is the moving forward. So this is our starting point. This was our starting point for St Brendan's in August. And if I could just ask Lorna to flick back to the slide previous, if that's okay. So in August, part of the first day of the in-service day, it would have been myself if I'd still been in post, but the acting head was taking this forward and saying, look, let's see what the children were telling us in May. Let's look at our red column and our amber column, and let's see this year if we can really focus and drill down into what is it the children are telling us and what do we need to improve as a school. And hopefully by our May next year, which will be 2022, this is when we're hoping to see a positive change. If you could just move on, please, Lorna, thank you. Thank you. So just before we go on to Ali's section, I think we could just have a few minutes because we're quite good for time. It's only 3 minutes past 4. I think we could have a few minutes to think, is there any questions that have come up in the chat pane or anything that you would like to, you know, point out, highlight?
Yeah, Maureen, we've got a couple of questions that have come up into the chat pane. So I'm just scrolling back to that first one. So one of the questions is, and this Ali might be able to help with this one as well. They've said they've just started using GMWP, which is great. And what they're asking is, was there any consideration in asking questions about home life or community as part of the GMWP?
Yeah, I mean, I think having not been at the original development of the GMWP, because that happened quite a long time before I was in post. However, I think that the rationale behind that is to do with the self-determination theory being a sort of universal kind of theory of well-being. And second to that, I think maybe why the psychological service takes that up is because that's how, as psychologists, we approach our work with children and young people, and we take what's known as an ecological approach to well-being, where if we are in consultation with pupils and teachers, we will look at the system supporting the child in the middle. So we would look at the school system, the family system, and the community system, and how that interacts in terms of supporting young people well-being. So we acknowledge that some of the presentation of young people that you see in schools is a function of many different interacting things at different levels. So hopefully that kind of explains a little bit more. And do you have anything else that you want to contribute to that?
No, Ali, I think you've covered that perfectly. Definitely
Okay, good.
Back into the self-determination theory of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you are interested in an evaluation tool around well-being that looks at kind of home life and family life, there's a really good example from East Renfrewshire Council, which when I stop presenting, I'll be able to dig in and find the link to that, because they've done a good piece of work around looking at well-being, taking into consideration the home life and community. So thank you for that question. Next question from Graham Parry, and actually when this question came up, you were just coming on to the section about how you use the data. So Graham was asking, how are you supporting children and young people to offer personal reflections which are not tokenistic? And I guess for me, that section is about the fact that you are sharing the results with the learners, and they are very much involved in what their next steps are, or what the next steps for the whole school or the class would be. More to add to that?
No, I would. That's a great point. But I think for the purpose of this presentation today, I was only looking at whole school data. But because we have all of the information, all of the data for individual children, then during our tracking meetings with our ASN coordinator, with our nurture coordinator, then that we look at each separate class, and we can look at each separate individual child. And from looking at some of this information, then we can then start to look at forming our own targeted intervention groups within the school. So although that I didn't present that part of it today, we were just looking at the holistic whole school comparative data today.
I think as well, and very quickly, I think there's maybe a few things that I'll touch upon as well in terms of how the process is set up, and the sort of, the culture and ethos of being open and talking about well-being, and the importance that's placed on it, and how the young people understand their own data and all that sort of thing. That a lot of the teachers, when we were talking to them, were concerned about, would a pupil just say on one day, well, tick this, and this, but actually what comes out is actually not that, and that's part of the sort of setup and the implementation process that happens as well beforehand.
Yep, thanks, Sally. I'm conscious of time. There's just a couple of other questions that we'll do before we move on to Ali. One of them's from Jennifer Law. Do you use the same questions for secondary pupils?
Yes, Jennifer, we do. And interestingly enough, Renfrewshire Council are taking this forward with their secondary schools, and so have East Ayrshire Council. So I've been working with both of those councils and supporting the move with GMWP. So that's two authorities already that have started to look at it with their secondary pupils. And I really think with secondary, I think this is a beautiful tool to be using.
When does she hear about Duddingston?
Oh, I'm sorry, somebody's got their mic on.
And the beauty of using this, Jennifer, with secondary school pupils, I think is looking at that at the personal social development, the PSD section within secondary school.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maureen. That's great. Ali, I think what we'll do is we'll move on to you, and we'll if anybody else has got other questions, please feel free to carry on popping them into the chat, and it's good to see some positive feedback in relation to you using the tool as well. So Ali, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Okay, so my name's Alistair Mitchell. I'm one of the educational psychologists. Oh, sorry, just skip back. You've skipped one, Lorna. That's great. I'm part of Glasgow Psychological Service. I work in the northwest of the city. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some research that was ongoing over the 2020 to 2021 session. And really this piece of research was focused on the return to school phase, so that's August to December 2020. The rationale for the research was that we, as a service and across Glasgow, had a hunch, pretty big hunch, that the impact of the pandemic was going to lead to a pretty significant focus on well-being, as I'm sure it was across all local authorities. Also, in speaking to Maureen, she had been working with the GMWP for a while, and she highlighted that in 2020, pupils were answering less positively on the GMWP than in 2019. So that suggests that there was an impact of the pandemic and the school closures. As a service, we had been looking at ways to support schools to track and monitor well-being. And one of the interesting things when it came to discussing the use of the GMWP with Maureen was that St Brendan's vision for using it was to use the GMWP to empower pupils to meet their own well-being needs, rather than testing the efficacy of an off-the-shelf intervention. So it's slightly different to the way that we use our pre and post measures and then maybe use a tried and tested off-the-shelf intervention, but actually a much more empowering collaborative way of using data with pupils leading on it. So that was why the research came about. And if we could skip to the next slide, that would be fab. So the research took what was an exploratory case study, which took a focus on how the GMWP was being used within St Brendan. So we as EPs have a role in understanding the complex process by which impacts are made. Quite often, interventions that are designed to improve outcomes are implemented in really messy schools systems, and so it's really important to establish the ways in which things are working, rather than just kind of having the pre and the post data, but actually understanding what is going on in the meantime. So the case study was developed across August to the end of the 2021 session, but this data that I'm going to talk to you about today was really from the August to December part. And what we did was we had 14 pupils and 7 staff, and we did a series of focus groups with pupils from the P5 to P7 cohort and teachers as well, to identify what was going on when the GMWP process was occurring in St Brendan's. So if we could skip to the next slide. So I had 4 research questions. How is the GMWP being used in St Brendan's to meet pupil wellbeing needs? How has the GMWP helped to shape interventions, and what perceived impact has it has on pupils' outcomes? What are the systemic affordances and constraints of using the GMWP? So what are the things within the school that helps the system and the process, and what are the things that maybe hinders the process? And in what ways can the GMWP tool and approach be developed to meet pupils' wellbeing needs? And the focus initially was for the learning community, and then obviously it's kind of snowballed into being used nationwide. So we are looking at kind of ways in which we can capture that as well. So moving on to the next slide. So some initial findings. Again, there's still findings to be written up for the latter part of the session, but the initial findings from August to December highlighted a few things. So what was very evident in research question 1, how is the GMWP being used? Well, it was very much as we thought, led by Maureen and her leadership team. The GMWP process highlighted through teacher and pupil focus groups that it was being used in a really empowering way, where pupils were given access to their own data as a class, and were engaged in really deep and meaningful conversations about what their well-being looks like, and how they can, as a group with a teacher, plan to improve their well-being. And in research question 2, some of the things that were that happened as a result of that process was that, first of all, the senior leadership team had an overview of the entire pupil cohort well-being. Teachers reflected that it gave a greater insight into pupils' feelings than they were aware of. So that reflects some research by Flett and Hewitt there that suggests that actually, as education staff, we're perhaps not as good as we think we are always at identifying those pupils that are that do have well-being needs. And some of the things that the pupils were suggesting that were acted upon were things like regular check-ins, calm spaces, post-interval regulation time, worry boxes, and also a real focus that classes were focusing on how to support each other with listening skills. And some of the things that was noticed by pupils and staff when we asked them, so what do you feel has changed? Well, during the August to December period, pupils and teachers noticed that pupils showed improved listening to each other, that there was better engagement in lessons, and that classes seemed to be able to display become better at regulating their emotions and helping each other out in class. Now, I know that Maureen shared data that showed that there were decreases in well-being overall, but from the perspective of the pupils and teachers, they were seeing something that maybe in the early part was really positive. In terms of the systemic affordances and constraints of the GMWP, what helped and hindered the process? Well, there was a real emphasis on, and this might come into some of the questions that we were talking about before, is that what makes it tick is that if leadership really place importance on well-being and lead the GMWP, give time for decisions to be made in tracking meetings, help teachers to understand and discuss their data, and sort of take away the anxiety of those conversations that can be quite tricky about how well your class is feeling, and giving up a significant amount of time within the improvement plan to really work on that. In terms of other affordances that really helped the process were, again, this has been a staged process, as Maureen had said. The GMWP process had been used for years and had been built up from a smaller intervention to larger whole school approaches. So teachers that had previous experience of using the GMWP felt more confident, and certainly that was felt, especially when there was support from senior leadership. Some of the things that maybe hindered the process or were challenging to the process were teachers' perceived competence. So, being able to have those difficult conversations, being able to understand the data, and to scaffold those conversations with children about what this actually means, and their own understanding of the data. What does this mean? What should I do? How do I plan for this? And the other sort of constraints that maybe were on it was, from P1 to P7 is quite a developmental range. So what are the pupils' understanding of data? Can they access data in the same way? So that was when staff started thinking about ways in which to adapt the presentation of the data so that they could engage pupils in discussion about what to do next. And in what ways can the GMWP approach be developed to meet people's wellbeing needs? Well, some of the things that were suggested was that, again, using the GMWP data as part of a triangulation approach. So are there other ways in which you can also gather wellbeing information from pupils, whether that's through conversations or check-ins, or but having the GMWP as the core, perhaps streamlining the process in terms of how it comes in terms of your planning for the year. If you're a class teacher, when you get the data, what that means, what you focus on in terms of your wellbeing curriculum, and developing approaches to and teaching strategies to support participation in the discussion from all pupils. So that's just a flavour of some of the research findings. There will be further research findings that are still to be written up, but that gives you a sense of what the research was saying in the August to December part of the last session. So if we can move on. So I suppose for this part, it was just to have a think about then, if you are looking to use the GMWP, there might be some things that you might want to consider. So we know from change processes, when we think about implementation and changes, schools should consider the perceived attributes of the change and also the readiness of the school as a whole for the change. So this might involve some self-evaluation prior to the change, or it might mean that you trial it on a smaller scale in order to understand how to develop it within your establishment. And one of the reasons we talk about this is because of a theory of implementation science. And I've just picked out one aspect of this. Blanchard, 2006, provides a list of predictable reasons for why change efforts may fail. And one of the important things that they raise is that that sometimes where there's a failure to focus and there's a prioritization of what they call death by 1,000 initiatives, a common problem for school is that when you have an abundance of off-the-shelf initiatives, nothing really sticks, and this can lead to staff knowing that things will pass. So going back to the rationale for why we're involved in this piece of research, what we felt was really interesting was that this approach to empowerment and collaborating with pupils rather than bringing that off-the-shelf next thing to be implemented was a really useful and valuable way to approach pupil well-being. And some of the questions we have here, I'm not going to go through all of them, are things that you might want to consider. You might want to think about how your school culture is whether you're ready in terms of is well-being discussed and openly prioritized. Do you as a school leadership team fully support the use of the GMWP? And are pupils prepared to discuss the data in GMWP? Are you ready as a school for those sort of conversations? And does staff understand the need for change and are on board with the use of this this tool? So there are lots of things to think about, but that's not to say you don't just jump in and try it. But there's also that idea of these are some things that you might want to consider before you go in. However, it's not to say that you couldn't just run with it after this session today. So I think that's me coming to the next slide, and I think we're opening for questions because we have a little bit of time before the end of the session to open up to the floor, as it were.
That's great. Thanks, Ali. Much appreciated. There has been a couple of questions come through in the chat. I'll just pick up on Jamie. Jamie asked a question about, so do the results that's gathered allow for both whole school, class, targeted approaches? Just curious to know in and around a particular example and how those children are supported to signpost to other services. And so I guess my response to that would be that, you know, it's up to then, once you analyse the data, and you can do that on an individual, whole class or a whole school basis, and then it would be up to the school to determine what, you know, who would best to engage with to support that. Maureen, anything to add to that?
Yes, Lorna, I was just going to add that when we use the GLOW forum and all the data is compiled onto the Excel sheet, you can use the little tabs at the top to select. So you could narrow it down, so you could select the primary 2 class, and then you would only be copying and pasting over the primary 2 information, or you could actually just select individual children. Sometimes we've selected some of the children that are actually in our nurture class, so then we're only focusing on looking at the nurture children. From the tabs on the Microsoft, you can start to siphon down and determine as to, you know, whether it be an individual or a class or a whole school.
I think it does fit quite well with a staged intervention approach, in the sense that you do have that whole school and then that class, and then you have that you are able to pick out the young people that may be needing a more targeted approach to well-being beyond that. But also it does show you, again, from what teachers were saying, it does show you maybe perhaps those pupils that you perhaps were thinking were really getting on quite well, or who were perhaps masking and weren't kind of showing outwardly the signs that they were distressed, but kind of keeping a few things, under wraps a little bit.
Yeah. Ali, I would definitely say that. When we started to look and analyse the data, that we were really quite surprised at the children that were masking, who would never have came up during our tracking conversations. These children would have been on track across the board, and these discussions would have been, these children are on track. But then when we started to look at what the children were saying, we were actually thinking the children are actually telling us something different about how they're feeling, about their own confidence and their own work, etc. So it's really interesting that to be able to identify children that wouldn't have been just the obvious children that would have been normally brought up in a discussion. So lots of insight, I think that's what I would say.
Yep, no, that's great. Excellent. Thank you very much. Any other questions? I can't see any more coming through just now. There was one earlier. I'm just going to scroll back up to that one because it was about timings, Maureen. So let me just check. Miss Taylor was asking, just asking about why November and May months were used to gather the information. And they're just interested as they focused in August and was planning to reassess in January.
That was just the months that we chose. Originally, we thought, should we do it 3 times a year? We thought August, January, and then May. But to be quite honest with you, we thought that's too much. We really can't get through that amount. And I think September, October would have been ideally when that's when we would normally do it. That's allowing children to move into their next class, to get settled in, to build relationships within their own class and new teacher. I think last year with the recovery phase, that's why we were delayed in completing them in November. But, you know, whenever you feel it's appropriate. And as Ali said, this has taken a few years to develop. Initially, we didn't have a comparative. We weren't able to do a November and May. We only had the tools to be able to identify one area and then work on the next steps from there. So the fact now that we've got the David Patrick's magic tool, that we can do the comparative now, I mean, you can do it as many times throughout the year as you like.
Actually, it was interesting because pupils were saying that they'd like it done more often, but I don't know how you feel about gathering that information weekly, Maureen.
Oh, they like to share their feelings in St Brendan's, that's all I'm saying.
No, that's really helpful and much appreciated as well. Just one other question's come into the chat before I share, because I know some people were asking about suggested intervention, so I was going to show where you could find that. So Michelle's asked, how long does the assessment planning take per child?
Well, Michelle, as I'd mentioned earlier, this has been a process in developing. When we started off, we used a paper copy, and then the paper copy information had to be then collated and typed into the Microsoft form. You may not have iPads. We were very, very fortunate and very lucky in Glasgow that we had the iPad rollout. So on average, with the children using their iPads, it takes about 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And because it's a Glow form, if you've used the Microsoft Glow forms before, all of that information is just collated together. Nobody needs to do anything with it. If you don't have iPad, then you can still use the paper copy. It's going to take longer to input into the Glow form, but it's the same process. And the other version that we've used over the years is we've used the PC, but again, that's restricted because it's only one child, one Microsoft form. So I hope that's been helpful.
No, thanks, Maureen. And I think actually just to highlight, the actual 20 questions itself is very quick. And for the class teacher or the person who's collating the data, you know, they've got that at their fingertips pretty much as soon as the information has been input. And it's really just a case of making sure that you do check your information relatively quickly after you've completed it, in case there's any obviously safeguarding issues that potentially might be coming out as part of your questions. I'm conscious of time. We are just literally about to finish up. I was going to click on this link to show you the PDF file. At the back of that file, you'll find the information that some people were asking about suggested interventions around agency affiliation and autonomy. They are literally just some suggestions. We didn't make an exhaustive list in there. It's very much down to your own circumstances as to what interventions you decide you put in place. If you do have any other further questions in relation to GMWP, please feel free to get in touch with us at Education Scotland. We'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. And certainly we're well aware of a lot of people that are now using it, so we'd certainly be able to put you in touch with other people who are maybe be able to answer those practical questions as well. So without further ado, I just want to say a final massive thank you to Maureen and to Ali for their time and their presentation today. Really great overview of GMWP and the research that Ali's been doing in Glasgow around the tool, and a massive thank you to everybody else for joining the session this afternoon, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And just so you know, I'm moving over into another session just now, looking at self-evaluation framework for whole school approaches in mental health. Starts at 4:45, so hopefully see you all in there soon. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye-bye.